So anyone that's picked up a newspaper in the last couple of years will know that the international refugee protection system is in crisis. I'm going to diagnose what went wrong and set out a plan for how we can fix it. I want to start with a bit of history about the Refugee Convention, which is the primary international instrument that sets out protections for refugees. So it was drafted in the aftermath of World War II as a result of the failures of European states, or not European states, states all over the world to open their doors to asylum seekers. And the ill-fated journey of the St. Louis provides an instructive example. The St. Louis set off from Hamburg in 1939, carrying around 937 passengers, and most of which were Jewish refugees. And they headed to Cuba, where most of the asylum seekers most of the refugees had valid landing papers that were allowed to disembark there. But when they arrived, the Cuban government decided not to honor those papers. And so they headed up north to the United States, and they got within eyeshot of Miami. Passengers report people see the lights of Miami glistening on the horizon, but the US Coast Guard stopped them and told them they wouldn't be allowed to disembark in the US either. So with nowhere to go, they returned to Europe. Many of them ended up in France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, all of which later fell to the Germans, and it's estimated that about a quarter of the passengers on that boat ended up dying in concentration camps. So the impetus for the Refugee Convention was to stop incidents like this from happening again. And the cornerstone of the convention is the protection against non-refoulement, protection against refoulement or return. So this obligation that states cannot return people back to a place where they face persecution. But sadly, states around the world are increasingly turning their backs on these protections. They continue to pay lip service to international law and their obligations under international law and their obligations towards refugees, but they introduce measures aimed at blocking access to their territories and stopping asylum seekers from being able to seek protection. And my home country of Australia has been one of the leaders in pushing policies like this. It's been referred to as the deterrence paradigm, this approach to implementing refugee law. And you see this is an ad campaign the Australian government runs around the world to targeting would-be asylum seekers, let them know that they're not welcome in Australia. So my concern is that this deterrence paradigm creates fertile grounds for the spread of bad policies. Policymakers learn from what other governments are doing in all areas of policymaking. And in some ways it makes sense to keep your eye on what other countries are doing and to implement policies you think may be useful in your home country. There's no point reinventing the wheel if other countries have tried and tested models. But there are a few characteristics of asylum policymaking that I think make it particularly prone to transfers in general, but particularly bad transfers. The first is the fact that the countries increasingly share a common objective, and that is to keep asylum seekers away. They also share a common constraint on achieving that objective, which is the Refugee Convention. So when one country comes up with an innovation that plays lip service to their international obligations, but keeps asylum seekers away, it can spread like wildfire through the other countries operating in the same paradigm. The second factor is that the domestic asylum policy settings of states are interdependent. So the changes in one country can have ramifications for other countries. So at the most direct level, when a country rejects asylum seeker or migrant at its borders, it's pushing it on to a neighboring country. At a more indirect level, more stringent policies introduced in one country can redirect asylum flows to other destinations, sometimes on the other side of the world. And so in this context, they keep a really close eye on what other countries are doing. And when one country introduces restrictive policies, it places pressure on other countries to do the same. So Australia shows as an example of, I guess, the logical conclusion of where these comparative transfers get you to. So we've basically completely shut down our borders to asylum seekers arriving by boat. And you might be familiar with some of the policies we use. We intercept boats at sea and we push them back to their point of departure. The asylum seekers we can't push back we transfer to our offshore processing sites on Nauru and Manus Island in Papua New Guinea. So the idea is that these are third countries, people transferred there, no longer Australia's responsibility. They're processed under Nauru and Papua New Guinea law, and they either settle there and found to be refugees or get resettled elsewhere. But Australia is very clear that they can never come to Australia. What you might not know is that these policies come straight from the US playbook, and the United States has been running similar policies for many years and played a very direct role in informing Australia's policies. So they've been pushing boats back at sea since 1981 with the start of the Haitian interdiction program, and they've had an offshore processing regime operating in Guantanamo Bay since the mid-1990s. And Guantanamo is better known for the site of hosting, detaining enemy combatants caught in the War of Terror. But before that, it was used for migrant processing, and it still is used for that purpose now. But the use of that territory, they chose it for the same reason that they would later use it for enemy combatants. And that is, it's an area over which the US exercises full control, but it's technically not part of the United States. The sovereignty still lies with Cuba. So they're held beyond the reach of, both physically beyond the borders of the state, and also beyond the legal protections that apply there. Now, Australia didn't have an equivalent of Guantanamo Bay, so we outsourced to our Pacific neighbours to create a similar scenario. So now we have calls for Europe to follow the Australian model. But I mean, the irony is really we should be talking about the US model. Our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, did a tour of Europe at the height of the migration crisis a couple of years ago. And he gave a very prominent lecture here in London where he called upon European leaders to follow Australia's lead and to implement Australian-style policies and stop asylum seeker boats from reaching Europe's shores. And he found quite a receptive audience. At first, it was amongst the parties on the far right of the spectrum. Here's a screenshot from a YouTube video from Geert Wilders from the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands. And in that video, he basically calls on Europe to heed Tony Abbott's call for them to follow Australia's lead. And you'll see he's ripped off the ad campaign, the infographic directly from the Australian government's campaign, just subbing out the word Australia for the Netherlands. So you will never make the Netherlands home. But the worry is that this has moved, calls for the Australian model have now moved on, and they've been picked up by parties that have been traditionally in the centre or the left of the political spectrum. So we've got the Social Democrats in Denmark now that have an official policy platform that involves exclusive use of offshore processing and not processing asylum claims in Europe or in the Netherlands. So I have grave concerns about what this sort of competitive cycle of transfers of bad policies, what this says for the future of asylum. And as more and more countries adopt restrictive measures, it places more pressure on other countries to do the same. And then we have this vicious cycle, this race to the bottom, the end point of which is what Australia is doing now, completely shutting their borders down to asylum seekers. And if all countries did what Australia did, then persons in immediate danger would have nowhere to access protection. And we'd have a repeat of scenarios like we saw on the passengers aboard the St. Louis, where they're adrift at sea with nowhere to seek refuge. And I mean, this is closer than we might think. I mean, events just this week in the Mediterranean show how close we are to this situation happening again. When Italy decided to close its ports to an NGO vessel that had rescued some migrants off the coast of Libya, and the Italian government decided to shut its ports and tried to shift responsibility to Malta. Malta said they wouldn't let the asylum seekers disembark there. And the humanitarian crisis was only averted after Spain stepped in and agreed to take responsibility. But next time, there might not be a country that steps up and accepts the refugees. And so, really, the key to saving asylum is ending this competitive approach where countries concentrate their efforts on shifting responsibility to each other rather than working together. And this might not be as hard as you think, because the root cause of this competition stems from one feature in the way international refugee law is currently being implemented. A refugee is the sole responsibility of whatever country they manage to physically reach. So this incentivizes refugees to take longer or more dangerous journeys to reach wealthy destinations, and also encourages those same wealthy destinations to implement increasingly restrictive and punitive and expensive measures aimed at keeping them away. But imagine a world where responsibility for refugee protection was collectivized. States would be equally responsible to protecting refugees, no matter where in the world they happen to be physically situated. So an approach based on cooperation rather than competition. So there'd be one single global refugee processing system. So you could apply for refugee protection anywhere in the world. If found to be in need of protection, you'd go into a single pool to be redistributed in safe countries around the world. Countries would contribute funding as well as resettlement spots based on their relative capacity, so with wealthy countries contributing more. That fundamental principle of non-refoulement, or non-return, would remain sacrosanct. No refugee would be pushed back to a place where they face persecution. But at the same time, simply arriving in a particular country wouldn't necessarily equate to be able to settle there permanently. So a refugee in Africa would have the same chance of permanent settlement in Europe than one that reaches Europe's shores. And so this will take away that incentive to make those dangerous journeys, and this cycle of deterrence that we see as countries compete to keep asylum seekers away. And this wouldn't require amending the Refugee Convention in any way. In fact, it's likely more in line with the way the drafters of the convention envisaged the convention being implemented. The preamble to the convention states that protecting refugees can place heavy burdens on specific countries, and that the only way to reach a satisfactory solution to the issue is through cooperation. And so the key to saving asylum is fostering this cooperation. So if you want to learn more, please check out my book, Refuge Lost, Asylum Law in an Interdependent World. And if you want to learn more about what a collective approach could look like in practice, check out the work of my colleague, Professor Jim Hathaway, who's written extensively on the topic. Thank you.